Hello, this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader. Today I will be reading Chapter 3 and 4 from Two Very Rare Bears by S.P. Bullock and G.S. Worth. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to the authors for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 3. The next thing they knew, they were hit by a blinding light. "I can't see anything. I'm blinded," said Harry. Then they heard voices. "Oh my gosh," they thought. "What is this?" As their sight slowly adjusted, they realized it was the sun. The container doors, which had been swinging widely in the storm, were now still and open. The storm had passed, and suddenly they felt relieved. Harry crept to the edge of the container and peered outside. He couldn't believe what he saw. Dozens of men and women clearing the decks of the ship. There were piles of cargo scattered all over. The storm had devastated parts of the ship, but at least now it had passed and was replaced with bright sunshine. Harry soon realized the men and women were checking all the containers for damage. "George! George! Quick! They're going to find us. I don't know how we've got here, but I know we're not supposed to be here like this, walking and talking. They'll capture us, I know it. Come on, we've got to hide." Even though they didn't speak the same language, George instinctively knew what Harry was saying. They had to hide, and fast. George and Harry jumped out of the container and hid behind another. They were hidden by the shadow of the giant steel box. They heard loud voices. Immediately, George jumped to his feet and listened. They were speaking Mandarin. The men prized open the remaining container. Harry and George couldn't believe what they were seeing. Stacked inside were thousands of identical doggy bears with one difference. They were not alive like them. "Container 77, half the order is lost at sea," shouted the little bearded man who unlocked the container. "Churchills have lost 50% of their order," he shouted to the other man. "Leave the door open to let some air in. The salt water damage is only slight." "Okay," shouted the other man. "Relock in 1 hour." Then the men walked off. Harry and George sat in an eerie silence. They realized what they were. They were toys. And although they didn't know how, they were alive and heading for somewhere called Churchill's. They had 1 hour before the doors on the container 77 were due to be closed. Maybe there were more like them in there. They scampered into container 77 and instantly started shouting in English and Mandarin. "Hello! Hello! Can anyone hear us?" But no matter how many times they shouted, they were met with a ghostly silence. They were hit with the realization that it was just them, just George and Harry. Why them? How could they be alive and not any of the other identical doggy bears? It looked like they were thousands of them. Why? Why would there be thousands of little doggy bears all stuffed inside a container? George suddenly nudged Harry and passed him papers. They were written in English and Chinese. They both stood reading. "Churchill's Department Store. Advance Christmas Order. The Jade Emperor Toy Factory. 5,000 doggy bears. The Royal Collection, Churchill's Department Store. Covent Garden, London. WC2, England." "What's a department store?" thought Harry. George was scratching his head, obviously thinking the same thing. "What's Covent Garden? And what's London?" The little bears huddled together, bewildered. Then they heard voices and a huge clanking noise. They were instantly plunged into darkness. The container door had been shut. Not in an hour, as George had heard the little bearded man say, but in about 15 minutes. "George," whispered Harry, "hold my paw. We can't get lost. We can't be separated." Although he didn't understand, he held on to Harry's paw. Whatever Churchill's department store, Covent Garden, and London were, Harry and George were now going to find out. 2,502 bears were now heading there. Chapter 4. The ship was a regular on the route, and her crew always enjoyed the voyage, spending 6 to 7 weeks at sea. The ship became their home during this time, and the same was about to happen to Harry and George. However, the poor little bears were not going to enjoy their voyage, as they were trapped inside the cold, dark container. George could hear someone outside, laughing and talking. Speaking in Mandarin, the man said, "When we dock in 7 weeks, I'll take you to see the Queen's house, Buckingham Palace." George now knew the awful truth. 7 weeks stuck in a dark, cold, metal box. But how could he tell Harry? He couldn't actually talk to him. What on earth were they going to do? Well, one thing that bears can do, luckily, is go into hibernation, and doggy bears are no exception. George gripped Harry by the paws, and without a single word, a warm energy flowed between them. They huddled up to each other, and within minutes they'd both fallen into a deep, deep sleep. The remainder of the ship's crossing was fairly uneventful. The crew were looking forward to arriving on land, having a break, and seeing the sights the United Kingdom had to offer. The Wangshu approached Southampton docks almost 7 weeks to the day, laden with her cargo of goods, minus a crate of missing doggy bears. Churchill's department store would have to make do with half its Christmas order. The ship docked perfectly, her huge engines slowly shutting down. After the long voyage, Harry and George were in the deepest of sleeps, tightly cuddled up together. The vibrations from the engines had aided their slumber, and now, with the engines turned off, it stirred the little bears into slowly waking. Harry was the first to open his eyes, his little voice croaking, "George, I think we've arrived." George sat up in the darkness, hearing Harry's voice. They were trying to listen for any other voices, but there were none. They slowly came around and sat in silence, waiting. An hour passed, and the bears had now fully awoken from their 7 weeks' slumber. "I hope we hadn't woken up too early," said Harry. "What shall we do? Just sit in the darkness?" he pondered, while wondering what George was thinking. Then they heard a loud clanking on top of the container. A loud, rattling sound followed, then a sense of motion. It seemed like they were flying. What they didn't know was that they actually kind of were, because they were airborne and suspended by a huge crane, lifting their container from the Wangshu onto the dockside. And with a soft clunk of steel meeting concrete, they were at last on British soil. Stay tuned for Chapter 5 and 6. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book.